Now, last year I heard a story, in fact it was in an online video, of a police officer in the USA who helped two young boys. And then he went to go on one or two better. Permit me just to read you the story. John Mook, known as Jack, a Pittsburgh police detective and 20-year veteran of the force, is also a volunteer instructor at a non-profit organization providing area youth access to the sport of amateur boxing and mentorship from role models within their community. The local boxing gym is the place where this story began, where John Mook crossed paths with two youngsters seeking solace from their life situation. When brothers Joshua and Jesse turned up in around 2008, Mook became their trainer. And even at the onset, it was clear that the pair had a troubled home life. They were living with their parents in a dilapidated home with cockroaches and rats. The house was so bad that it was condemned after the boys were removed from their parents. Mook recalls taking the boys out to eat because Joshua was so skinny that you could literally see his rib cage. As time went on, the three began to build a rapport, and the boys began to build a routine, coming to the gym multiple times each week, until they didn't. Of course, this type of situation wasn't entirely new to Mook. As a veteran police officer who'd patrolled the streets for years, he'd seen poor kids on the street his whole life and on the job. Initially, he thought that as a boxing coach, he wasn't going to get involved, so long as the boys continued to turn up for their training. But when they were nowhere to be found, Mook set out to find them. In December 2012, Mook located the boys, picking them up from school. They were in bad shape. As Mook recalled, Josh had hair missing and blotches on his face, and Jesse was crying. "The kid never cried," he said. The brothers told Mook that they hadn't been allowed to return to the gym. It was in that moment that Mook began to learn about just how bad the boys had it. Mook said that the brothers have had it as worse as any other kid that ever lived in the city of Pittsburgh, living conditions wise. As it turned out, they were living in an abusive environment with neglectful foster parents. In an interview, Mook recalled how Josh describes his living conditions. "Coach, we had to sleep on the floor, and there's nothing but dog feces on the floor." The boy said that Joshua's plan was to hide from the horrible situation. He said, "I'm trying to sleep my life away. I go to sleep as early as possible so I can sleep until I have to go back to school." Shortly after these revelations were revealed, one of the boys' guardians was involved in a police chase and a car crash. And that was the final straw for Mook. In January 2013, Detective Mook filed an emergency order that took the boys out of their foster home and brought them into his. Mook has gone from cop and coach to friend and mentor. And now, he's family. In September 2014, Jack Mook finalized the adoption of Joshua and Jesse. And if you've seen the video, you'll know that there was nothing but absolute delight on the boys' faces when they heard the news that they were to be adopted. And I'm sure you can imagine that would be the case, given all that they'd experienced in their little lives up to that point. I'm going to change tack a couple of times throughout our sermon this morning. I want to turn back for a moment to our gospel reading and see how that might link in a little bit to what we've just heard. Starting with what is commonly known as the Beatitudes, that contrasts the blessings that will be for the poor and the condemnation for the rich. A few weeks ago, we looked at the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And while I'm not going to resurrect that whole story again, perhaps you'll recall that Lazarus was poor and was eventually blessed in heaven. Whereas the unnamed rich man, well, let's just say that things didn't work out quite so well for him. Not simply because he was rich, but because in his complacency, he ignored the plight of the poor. He had received so many blessings in life, and he didn't use them to move even his little finger to help those whom he had been put on this earth to help. In some ways, the Beatitudes are an extrapolation of that story for us. Jesus gives some explicit examples of the haves on the one side who look after just their own, important as it is to look after our own, but also the poor who look to God for assistance because no one else is looking out for them. The admonition is more about what goes on in the inside than the picture that we paint of ourselves on the outside to all who might see it. His exposition practically demands that we think about how we care for others, especially those who are disadvantaged or vulnerable, for whatever the reason, and to examine our motives in life. Just to join up some of the dots at this point already, Jesus often mentioned the need to treat children well. After all, who are more vulnerable? Now, to change the topic again for a moment, this morning we've enjoyed the sacrament of baptism. And perhaps we're reminded again and again of what a gift children are. We rejoice with the Hamilton family and their extended family and friends in the birth and now the baptism of Olivia. But not all children are so fortunate to be born into a family that loves them so completely. Sometimes children are unwanted, unloved. Other times they are loved, but the parents feel unable to support their children. In yet other, more morbid circumstances, children sometimes lose their family. They're orphaned. I don't want to make any kind of moral judgments of any of those situations and circumstances just here right now, but for these and for other reasons, some children find themselves fostered and or adopted. What a blessing if they finally find a family that gives them the love that every child deserves. What a blessing. With good cause to remember and celebrate Adoption and Orphans Sunday. Now, when it comes to life circumstances, children very often don't know anything different from what they're presented with in life. It perhaps takes an adult's eye and the benefits of hindsight and the ability to deconstruct a childhood to realize just how good or how poor a childhood or an upbringing might have been. Our natural inclination is to believe that we've been brought up well, and that's the model that we often compare when we raise our own children. We perhaps try to recreate our best childhood memories for our children. We want them to have anything that we didn't have ourselves. We try to avoid the worst of the excesses of how we were raised. And if something seemed boring to us, or we maybe just never acquired the taste, we're inclined to help our children to maybe avoid it. You didn't like mince and tatties when you were growing up? You're unlikely to feed it to your kids. You found church boring. You're more inclined to let it pass. You hated sports. You're more than likely to let them have the occasional day off school. But if you liked climbing trees, as we learned about last week, well, you're more than likely to encourage them to that kind of activity. Is there especially an inclination to try to make up for something, for either that which we didn't have ourselves, or perhaps for those children who are adopted, for the things that they might enjoy in life? And perhaps that's the crux of the matter in some of the recent relationship issues that are very much in public view between Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie on the other side of the planet. Yet for all the risks that are taken within the idea of adopting children, adopters should be applauded. It takes a special kind of person and a special kind of love to choose someone to be your child. Your own children, usually, you naturally love. You bonded with them at first sight, and probably even before first sight. Perhaps first kick. Perhaps first heartbeat. Perhaps first photograph, as we look at some of the sonographs that we get these days, or even 3D and 4D ones these days. You can murder them sometimes, but you still love them. But to choose a child that isn't yours, that's a special kind of love. And you've perhaps heard stories of where a child is looked after and eventually they come to love their surrogate parent either before or after they're adopted, as in the story that I started with there this morning. It's wonderful. It can bring a tear to the eye on more than one occasion. Now there's also a gospel application that the Christian needs to know about adoption. But first of all, I want to contrast it with the baptism that we've had this morning. Today, Olivia, like most all of us here probably, have been baptized. The church has shown faith in her and in her family, that she'll be raised in a Christian way with Christian values and teachings, and that she'll hopefully come to make Christianity her own. When the time comes, that'll be her decision to make. She won't be coerced into it. Meanwhile, she will always have a home in the Christian community, and especially here at the Old Kirk. It's my privilege and my pleasure to be her minister. Further, it is our belief that she's a child of God, regardless of what she does in life, good or ill. She has been created in His image and likeness. And she most certainly is a gift of God, even if she won't let the minister pick her up. This we could say of all of us. We were born as children of God, a gift of God, regardless of how much our parents wanted us, whether we were an accident or planned. Perhaps you were baptized here or someplace else, and you have that privilege to have a home in the Christian community, whether you make use of it now, sometime in the future, or never at all. Perhaps you're mostly good living, whether we make mistakes or not. There's not one of us perfect. We may have been raised with Christian values. We may have some affection for the church. All of that says an awful lot about us, perhaps especially on the outside. But what does that say about the inside? Sometimes we do things as a response to a need that we see, out of the goodness of our own heart, is the way the saying goes. Sometimes we do things out of habit. I confess there are times I do that myself. Sometimes we do things because we love Christ. And here is where something special comes in. The first letter of John, which we may have read a couple of weeks ago during our Bible challenge, informs us that this is a new thing. God loves us first, not the other way around, and then we come to love God. And Paul, when he was writing to the Ephesians, informs us that God adopts us into His family. Adopted. We may already be children of God, but in a special sense, Paul uses the word adopted to express a change in the Christian experience. This isn't an external thing. This isn't predicated on church attendance or even in being raised in a Christian way. This is an internal thing, a soul thing. It's happened to some folks who've never darkened the door of a church. It's happened to some folk despite all that churchy folk have thrown at them. When we truly love Christ, it is in itself, that love of Christ, evidence that we have been adopted into the family of God. And we are part of that long line of saints that are commemorated on All Saints' Day today. Not the pure as the driven snow type of saint, but the love God with your whole heart and strength and mind and power kind of saint. And as a consequence of that internal change, loving our neighbor, loving our enemy, loving the poor or the sick or the disadvantaged, doing what we were placed on this earth to do, caring for the children, the vulnerable, and showing some justice in the world is so much easier. Not necessarily easy, but so much easier. And we don't do it so that God will adopt us. We do it because God has adopted us. And that transition point where something special comes in, Christ already loves you. Do you love him?